The silence arrived without a final argument, without a goodbye, without one last message to explain what happened. One day, everything simply stopped. Sighs. No closure, no answers, just an empty space where communication used to be. And that kind of silence can feel unbearably one-sided. While you're left replaying every memory, questioning every decision, and searching for meaning, it can seem as though they walked away without a second thought and continued living as if nothing ever happened. Curious. But what if that picture isn't the whole story? What if the silence affects them in ways that are completely different from what you imagine? Understanding what takes place on the narcissist side of that silence can completely transform the way you see your own recovery. Because despite the image they often project, they are not simply sitting in perfect peace, untouched by the ending. They are facing something they were never emotionally equipped to manage. Once you recognize what is really happening beneath the surface, you stop judging your own healing by what they appear to be doing. You stop believing their outward behavior is proof that they won or that you lost. Instead, you begin to understand that appearances and reality are often two very different things. If narcissist recovery has helped you better understand the manipulation, confusion, and emotional damage you've experienced, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the deeper psychological patterns behind narcissistic behavior, so you can stop questioning yourself and start rebuilding your confidence with clarity. Now, let's begin with the most important part of this story, your experience, because that's where real healing always starts. When you finally stop reaching out to a narcissist, most people expect that you'll immediately feel lighter. They imagine relief will arrive the moment communication ends, but that is rarely how recovery begins. Instead, what many survivors experience feels much closer to withdrawal than freedom. It can be confusing because part of you knows the relationship was unhealthy, yet another part desperately wants to reconnect. That contradiction often makes people question their own judgment. They wonder, if this person hurt me so much, why can't I stop thinking about them? The answer is far more psychological and neurological than most people realize. The word withdrawal is not an exaggeration. It accurately describes what can happen inside the brain after leaving a relationship built on manipulation, inconsistency, and emotional unpredictability. Studies on trauma bonding suggest that relationships characterized by intermittent reinforcement, where affection, approval, and attention are given unpredictably, activate the brain's reward system in powerful ways. Rather than receiving steady emotional security, your nervous system becomes conditioned to chase unpredictable moments of validation. The cycle itself becomes addictive. Think about the way a slot machine works. A person doesn't keep pulling the lever because every attempt brings a reward. In fact, the unpredictability is exactly what keeps them engaged. Every loss creates anticipation that the next attempt might finally be the winning one. That uncertainty generates dopamine, the neurotransmitter heavily involved in motivation, anticipation, and reward-seeking behavior. Narcissistic relationships often function in a remarkably similar way. One day they are affectionate, attentive, and deeply invested in you. They make you feel uniquely understood, admired, and emotionally significant. Then, without warning, they become distant, critical, cold, or completely unavailable. Suddenly you're wondering what changed. You start analyzing every conversation, every text message, every facial expression, searching for the moment you supposedly made a mistake. The emotional highs become incredibly rewarding precisely because they follow periods of emotional deprivation. Over time, your brain begins associating relief with their approval. Every time they return after withdrawing, every apology they offer, every affectionate message after days of silence feels disproportionately meaningful. It isn't because the affection is extraordinary. It's because your nervous system has been deprived of consistency. Small moments of kindness begin to feel like enormous emotional rewards. This is how trauma bonds quietly develop. They are not simply emotional attachments. They become deeply embedded patterns inside your nervous system. Instead of learning that love is safe and reliable, your brain learns that love must be earned, chased, and constantly protected from disappearing. Stability begins to feel unfamiliar, while inconsistency becomes strangely normal. Then comes the silence. When you stop reaching out, or when the relationship finally ends, your brain doesn't instantly understand that you're protecting yourself. It simply notices that the source of its familiar reward pattern has disappeared. The emotional cycle it became accustomed to is suddenly interrupted. As a result, your nervous system begins searching for the missing stimulus. That is why you find yourself rereading old conversations, scrolling through photographs, checking social media profiles, or replaying arguments repeatedly in your mind. You may compose long messages that you never actually send. You imagine what you would say if they suddenly contacted you again. You rehearse conversations in the shower, while driving, or lying awake at night. Sometimes you even hear imaginary versions of their voice in your head as your brain attempts to complete unfinished emotional loops. Many survivors judge themselves harshly during this stage. They believe these behaviors mean they are weak, obsessive, or incapable of moving on. In reality, these reactions are incredibly common among people recovering from psychologically manipulative relationships. Your nervous system is attempting to adjust after months or even years of conditioning. The difficulty isn't simply that you miss the person. More often, you miss the emotional certainty your brain believes only they can provide, even though that certainty never truly existed. The relationship trained you to expect emotional instability, making your mind constantly search for signs that the next moment of connection might finally bring lasting peace. Ironically, the very unpredictability that exhausted you is also what makes letting go so difficult. Human brains naturally seek resolution. When a story feels unfinished, our minds continue returning to it. Narcissistic relationships rarely end with satisfying explanations or mutual understanding. Instead, they often conclude with confusion, blame shifting, silence, or emotional manipulation. Your brain keeps searching for the missing ending because unresolved experiences demand attention. This is one reason survivors spend months trying to figure everything out. They believe that if they could just understand why the narcissist behaved the way they did, the pain would finally disappear. While understanding can certainly help, healing rarely comes from discovering one perfect explanation. It comes from gradually accepting that some people create confusion because confusion itself allows them to maintain control. Another reason the withdrawal feels so intense is because narcissistic relationships often become central to a person's emotional world. Many survivors slowly abandon hobbies, friendships, routines, and even parts of their identity while trying to preserve the relationship. Their emotional energy becomes increasingly focused on monitoring the narcissist's moods, preventing conflict, or earning approval. By the time the relationship ends, it can feel as though large portions of their own identity disappeared with it. This creates an enormous emotional vacuum. You're not only grieving the loss of a person, you're grieving the future you imagined together, the version of yourself that kept hoping things would improve, the years invested trying to make the relationship work, and the belief that your love could eventually heal someone who refused to take responsibility for their behavior. That grief is real, but it should never be mistaken for evidence that the relationship was healthy. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings survivors experience. They assume that because the pain feels overwhelming, the relationship must have been extraordinarily meaningful or uniquely destined. Yet emotional intensity and emotional health are not the same thing. Some of the most psychologically damaging relationships create the strongest emotional attachments precisely because they alternate between affection and rejection. Healthy love usually doesn't produce addiction. It produces safety. It allows your nervous system to relax rather than remain constantly alert. It doesn't require endless guessing, emotional bargaining, or sacrificing your self-worth for small moments of affection. Healthy relationships create consistency, trust, mutual respect, and emotional security, not constant anxiety about where you stand. Your pain today is not proof that you lost your soulmate. More often, it reflects the depth of the conditioning your nervous system endured. Recovery isn't about convincing yourself that you never loved them. It's about recognizing that love became entangled with fear, uncertainty, and survival. The encouraging part is that the brain is remarkably adaptable. The same nervous system that learned to expect chaos can gradually learn to trust consistency again. Every day you maintain healthy boundaries, resist checking their messages, reconnect with supportive people, and invest in your own life, you're teaching your brain a completely different pattern. At first, those healthier experiences may feel unfamiliar or even emotionally flat because your nervous system has become accustomed to emotional extremes. But over time, stability begins to replace chaos. Eventually, you notice something remarkable. You no longer wake up wondering whether they'll contact you. Their name stops dominating your thoughts. Songs, places, and memories lose their emotional grip. The silence that once felt unbearable slowly transforms into peace. Not because you forced yourself to forget, but because your nervous system finally learned that safety does not depend on someone else's unpredictable behavior. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: the pain you feel right now is not evidence that the relationship was right for you. It is evidence that your mind and body are healing from a pattern they were conditioned to survive. The withdrawal is temporary. The clarity that follows is lasting. As your nervous system recovers, you stop chasing the person who kept you emotionally hungry, and you begin choosing the life that finally allows you to feel safe, valued, and genuinely free. The pain you are feeling is not proof that the relationship was meant to last. It is evidence of how completely your mind and body adapted to survive an environment that constantly kept you emotionally off balance. Those are two very different realities. One speaks to love, while the other speaks to conditioning. Unfortunately, after living inside a narcissistic relationship for months or even years, those two experiences often become so intertwined that separating them feels almost impossible. Your nervous system learned to stay alert because it had to. It learned to scan for subtle changes in mood, shifts in tone, delayed responses, and emotional distance because those small signals often determined whether the day would end in affection or criticism. Over time, hypervigilance became your normal state. You weren't simply participating in a relationship anymore. You were adapting to survive an emotional environment that never felt completely safe. That is why healing feels so confusing. You are not just grieving the loss of a person. You are untangling deeply ingrained survival strategies that your brain mistakenly labeled as love. The anxiety, the longing, the constant mental replaying of memories, these are signs of a nervous system learning that it no longer has to remain on guard every moment of the day. Now let's turn our attention to what happens on the other side of the silence, because this is where many people become trapped by assumptions. When a narcissist disappears or stops communicating, most survivors imagine one of two extremes. The first assumption is that they are completely unaffected. People picture them moving on immediately, finding someone new within days, posting smiling photos, acting as though the relationship never mattered. From the outside, it can certainly appear that way. Narcissists often project confidence, independence, and emotional invulnerability. They know how to create an image that suggests they are thriving regardless of what has happened. The second assumption is almost the complete opposite. Some believe the narcissist is secretly devastated, sitting alone, overwhelmed with regret, replaying memories, desperately wishing they could return but being too proud to admit it. The reality is often far more psychologically complex than either of these popular narratives. To understand why, you first have to understand how narcissistic functioning is organized. At its core, a narcissistic personality is not built upon stable self-esteem or genuine inner peace. Instead, it relies heavily on external validation to maintain a fragile internal structure. Attention, admiration, emotional reactions, praise, fear, conflict, control, these become psychological fuel. Mental health professionals often refer to this fuel as narcissistic supply. Supply is much broader than compliments or admiration. It includes almost any interaction that confirms the narcissist's psychological importance. They want to know they matter, that they occupy your thoughts, that your emotions continue revolving around them. Whether those emotions are positive or negative often becomes less important than the simple fact that they are still emotionally significant. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic relationships. Many survivors believe they only fed the narcissist when they expressed love or admiration. But the reality is that your entire emotional investment became part of the system. Your affection reassured them. Your forgiveness reinforced their influence. Your hope kept you emotionally available. Even your frustration, your arguments, your desperate attempts to explain your feelings, and your anger all confirmed that they still held enormous psychological space inside your mind. Every emotional reaction communicated the same underlying message. You still matter enough to affect me. That message is incredibly valuable to someone whose sense of self depends upon external confirmation. So when silence first begins, many narcissists don't immediately experience panic. In fact, some initially enjoy it. Why? Because during the early stages, they often create an internal narrative that protects their ego. They imagine you are at home thinking about them constantly. They assume you're crying, checking your phone, waiting for them to return, or planning how to reach out. In their mind, your silence isn't interpreted as emotional independence. It is interpreted as evidence that you're overwhelmed by losing them. This imagined story allows them to preserve their sense of superiority. As long as they believe you remain emotionally attached, they continue feeling psychologically significant. They picture themselves as the unforgettable person who left a permanent mark on your life. Even without direct contact, they assume they still occupy the center of your emotional world. Notice something important here. This internal story does not require evidence. It only requires their belief. Because narcissistic defenses often prioritize protecting self-image over accurately interpreting reality, they naturally construct explanations that preserve their importance. If they haven't heard from you, they may simply conclude that you're too heartbroken to reach out, too ashamed to contact them, or secretly hoping they'll make the first move. These interpretations shield them from confronting a much more threatening possibility. That possibility is that you are genuinely beginning to move forward. At first, time doesn't necessarily challenge their assumptions. Days pass, maybe even weeks. They remain confident that eventually you'll break the silence, because that's what happened before. If previous cycles involved arguments followed by reconciliation, apologies, or repeated attempts to reconnect, they expect history to repeat itself, but something changes when it doesn't. The longer genuine silence continues, the harder it becomes to maintain the fantasy that nothing has shifted. Eventually, a subtle psychological discomfort begins to emerge. The silence no longer feels temporary. It no longer feels like a strategic pause before you inevitably return. Instead, it starts suggesting something far more unsettling. It suggests that your emotional life may no longer revolve around them. For most people, this would simply be disappointing. Relationships end, people heal, and life moves forward. But within a narcissistic psychological structure, this possibility carries a much deeper threat. The greatest fear is often not heartbreak itself, it is irrelevance. Heartbreak still acknowledges emotional significance. If someone breaks your heart, it means they mattered deeply. Rejection also confirms importance because another person consciously chose not to continue the relationship. Even anger recognizes emotional impact. Arguments, blame, resentment, and conflict all demonstrate continued psychological investment. Irrelevance is different. Irrelevance means someone wakes up without thinking about you. It means your name no longer creates an emotional reaction. It means your absence no longer shapes another person's decisions, moods, or identity. It means the psychological space you once occupied has quietly been reclaimed by healthier relationships, personal growth, meaningful goals, and inner peace. For a narcissistic personality that depends heavily upon external validation, this is extraordinarily difficult to tolerate. Why? Because irrelevance offers no emotional supply. There is nothing to control, nothing to provoke, nothing to manipulate, nothing to admire them, nothing to argue with, nothing to rescue, nothing to punish, nothing to dominate. There is simply absence. And absence provides no confirmation of importance. This is why some narcissists suddenly attempt to reappear months or even years after a relationship ends. The timing often surprises survivors because it seems disconnected from any obvious event. In reality, the renewed contact may have less to do with love or genuine self-reflection, and far more to do with testing whether they still occupy meaningful space in your emotional world. A simple message, a social media interaction, an unexpected phone call, or a casual question can serve one psychological purpose: finding out whether access still exists. If you respond with strong emotion, whether loving, angry, defensive, or desperate, the narcissist receives confirmation that the connection remains psychologically alive. But if they encounter calm indifference, firm boundaries, or no response at all, they face something far more difficult than rejection. They face evidence that life has continued without them occupying its center, and that realization challenges the very narrative that once protected their fragile sense of self. This understanding is not meant to encourage revenge or emotional games. Healing is never about proving anything to the narcissist. The goal is not to make them suffer or obsess over you. The goal is much healthier than that. It is to understand that your silence becomes powerful, not because it punishes them, but because it reflects something even more important. You are no longer organizing your emotional world around someone who depended on your attention to maintain their own sense of importance. That is the moment recovery truly begins. Not when they finally understand what they lost, but when you no longer need them to understand it at all. If you're no longer revolving around a narcissist, no longer emotionally available, chasing answers, or waiting for them, they're confronted with something their personality is built to resist. Psychologists often describe this as a narcissistic injury. It's not ordinary sadness or heartbreak. It's a wound to the carefully constructed identity that depends on validation, control, and emotional influence over others. To protect that fragile self-image, many narcissists shift into performance mode. They become more active on social media, rush into another relationship, or rewrite the story so that you become the villain and they become the victim. These behaviors are often less about genuine healing and more about preserving the image they want others and themselves to believe. Remember this: performance is not peace. People who have truly moved on rarely feel the need to constantly prove it. The louder the performance, the less it tells you about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Meanwhile, something far more important is happening inside you. The nervous system that spent months or even years preparing for the next criticism, the next silent treatment, or the next emotional roller coaster slowly begins to recover. Healing isn't instant. Some days still hurt, and memories can return without warning. But little by little, the urge to check their profile fades. The fantasy of who they could have been starts losing its power.
Then something remarkable happens. Pieces of yourself begin to return. You laugh without guilt. You make decisions without wondering how they'll react. You enjoy moments without constantly scanning for conflict. Those may seem like small changes, but they're signs that your identity is coming back. You're no longer surviving their chaos. You're reconnecting with the person you were before the manipulation. If you're in this season of silence, whether you're grieving, questioning yourself, or slowly finding peace, know that you're not walking through it alone. Healing isn't measured by how quickly you stop hurting. It's measured by how steadily you rediscover yourself. And that journey, one quiet day at a time, is where real freedom begins.